All right, Shalom Aleichem, everybody. Welcome back to our Torah study. All right, we're going to come back to our live feed here for those who are watching across the fruited plain. What time is it in Europe? Anybody know? I don't know. Germany? What's 7 hours? 5 o'clock in the morning? 5 a.m.? Okay, 4 or 5 a.m. roughly. In London. And what about my home country of France? Same? Okay. Baruch HaShem. All right, well, maybe Moshe and Korn will be waking up here soon, having their cup of tea or whatever, and be joining us, Baruch HaShem. And the rest of the people from the United Kingdom and France and all the other places. Baruch HaShem. All right, we're going to get back into our storytelling here. We left off nearing the birth of Moshe, and I have some things I'm gonna read this segment. Maybe read this two segments here from the Legend of the Jews, and I have some other insights I want to read from Rabbi Monk's commentary that are really interesting. That they all correlate back to Moshiach and the birth of Messiah and all that type of thing. There's an insight from Rabbi Monk that I really want to hone in on. That, you know, there's a lot of discussion from anti-missionaries a lot of times about the particulars about the Messiah's parents and all that kind of stuff. There's not a lot of information, and the information is seemingly sketchy. What we're going to find is that exact same situation is with Moses as well. So it's going to be interesting. So let's read this insight. Again, we're going back to the Legend of the Jews. We're on page 473. And the parents of Moses. So Shane did not pack the Legend of the Jews, but we're going to forgive him. So wait, they have it. Okay, they have it on the phone. Baruch HaShem. All right, so, so it says, when Pharaoh's proclamation was issued, decreeing that the men children of the Hebrews were to be cast into the river, Amram, who was the president of the Sanhedrin, decided that in the circumstances it was best for husbands to live altogether separate from their wives. He set an example. Therefore he divorced his wife, and all the men of Israel did likewise. For he occupied a place of great consideration among his people. One reason being that he belonged to the tribe of Levi, the tribe that was faithful to its God even in the land of Egypt, though the other tribes wavered in their allegiance and attempted to ally themselves with the Egyptians, going so far as to give up Abraham's sign of the covenant. These came to be known as Reformed Jews. No, I'm just kidding. That's not in there. I added that part. I just was interjecting an idea. So by the way, just note to self on that. Giving up the Abraham sign of the covenant which is circumcision, is to ally oneself with paganism. That's the take home for that, okay? So it goes on to say, to chastise the Hebrews for their impiety, God turned the love of the Egyptians for them into hatred, so that they resolved upon their destruction, mindful of all that he and his people owed to Joseph's wise rule. Pharaoh refused at first to entertain the malicious plans proposed by the Egyptians against the Hebrews. He spoke to his people, "You fools, we are indebted to these Hebrews for whatever we enjoy, and you desire now to rise up against them." So what it's saying here is that when the people of Israel turned away from the bris, turned away from the covenant, and tried to become buddy-buddy with the Egyptians, God turned their love into hatred. Now, I made a little joke about Reformed Judaism, but it should be noted that Reformed Judaism, which basically is an abandonment of the covenant entirely, began in Germany. That's in the 1800s, okay? So there's nothing new under the sun. So what happened is that all these Jews in Germany decided they wanted to become more German and less Jewish. And they just maintained a little semblance of their Judaism. And what happened was the German people came to hate them vehemently. obviously, right? So that's a note to all of us. So this is really important point I'm making here. If we think that the solution to anti-Semitism is to lessen our commitment to the covenant, we are sadly mistaken. The solution to anti-Semitism is not to take off our kippahs and pretend we're not Jewish and try to make friends with our neighbors. The solution to anti-Semitism is to be more Jewish and more committed to the covenant. Sagan, would you check the AC, make sure it's at its proper level? I see all the people waving the proverbial white flags, but they're really fans or plates. So it says, to chastise the Hebrews for their impiety, God turned the love of the Egyptians for them into hatred, mindful of all that he and his people owed. I read that part, excuse me. But the Egyptians, so the Pharaoh initially tried to dissuade the people, but the Egyptians could not be turned aside from their purpose of ruining Israel. They deposed their king and incarcerated him for 3 months. So they were so bent on destroying Israel, they incarcerated the king of it. Why is my wife back there? She's not with me. The Rebbetzin abandoned me. So it says they deposed their king and incarcerated him for 3 months until he declared himself ready to execute with determination what they had resolved upon. And he sought to bring about the ruin of the children of Israel by every conceivable means. Such was the retribution that they had drawn down upon themselves by their own acts. I want to reread that sentence. Such was the retribution they, that is the Jews, had drawn down upon themselves by their own acts. What were the acts that caused the retribution? Abandoning the laws of Moses. That's what got us into the mess known as the Egyptian enslavement. Okay? It's very important. The 7 steps of the 7 steps of separation. Right, exactly. What you aptly pointed out. So it goes on to say here, as for Amram, not only did he belong to the tribe of Levi, distinguished for his piety, but by reason of his extraordinary piety, he was prominent even among the pious of the tribe. He was one of the 4 who were immaculate, untainted by sin, over whom death would have had no power had mortality not been decreed upon every single human being on account of the fall of the first man and woman. So, let me pause there and say that Amram was one of the 4 men in history who never sinned, but only died because of the sin of Adam. Now, this is important because you will hear people tell you that the only one who ever kept the laws of Moses was JC because he was the only one who ever could. That is patently false. And if that were true, thank God it's not. If it were true, it would be an indictment against God. Because God what that would mean is the laws of Moses were so insurmountable that it took someone who wasn't really one of us, if you will. Like it took a divine being to do them. And that would be an indictment against God because God said that man can do them. You understand what I'm saying? It's very important, okay? Right. So God is not a man that he should lie. That's right. So if God said that man can do them, then it couldn't be just a divine man, so to speak, that could do them, right? Okay? So he died only because of the sin of Adam. Now it goes on to say the other 3 that led the same sinless life were Benjamin, Jesse the father of David, and Helab the son of David. Now if the Shekinah was drawn down close again to the dwelling place of mortals, it was due to Amram's piety. Originally, the real residence of the Shekinah was among men, but when Adam committed his sin, she withdrew to heaven at the first to the lowest of the 7 heavens. Thence she was banished by Cain's crime, and she retired to the 2nd heaven. The sins of the generation of Enoch removed her still farther off from men. She took up her abode in the third heaven, then successfully in the fourth, and on account of the malefactors in the generation of the deluge, and the fifth, and during the building of the Tower of Babel, and the confusion of the tongues in the sixth, and by reason of the wicked Egyptians at the time of Abraham, and finally she resides in the seventh, in consequence of the abominations of the inhabitants of Sodom. So 6 righteous men, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Levi, Kohath, and Amram, drew down the Shekinah back one by one from the seventh heaven to the first heaven, and through the seventh righteous man, Moses, she was made to descend to the earth and abide among men as aforetime. Now, let's pause there and talk about that for just a second. I don't know, some of you may have been eating a bagel, but what this is saying is that because of the sin of men over certain generations, the Shekinah went from being here with us on earth, level by level, up to the seventh heaven. Then these 7 men came along and drew her back down to the first level of Shemayim. And then Moses, the first Redeemer, came and drew her down to earth to be amongst men. Okay? It's a very important concept. Why? Because the final Redeemer will be like the first Redeemer. Yeshua says, I must go. Why? So that the Shekinah can come to you. Yeshua drew the Shekinah down to be among men again, just like Moses did. Okay? Very important. All right, so, goes on to say, oh, that was the French version. It says here, Amram's sagacity, that's a fancy way of saying his sage mind, sagacity, kept pace with his piety and his learning. The Egyptians succeeded in enslaving the Hebrews by seductive promises. Wait, what? Seductive promises. How does the enemy get us to do evil? Seductive promises. At first, they gave them a shekel for every brick they made, tempting them to do superhuman efforts by the prospect of earning money. Later, when the Egyptians forced them to work without wages, they insisted upon having as many bricks as the Hebrews had made when their labor was paid for, but they could demand only a single brick daily from Amram, for he had been the only one whom they had not led astray by their lying or artifice. He had been satisfied with a single shekel daily and had thenceforth made only a single brick daily, which they had to accept afterward as the measure of his day's work. Now, as his life partner, Amram chose his aunt Jochebed, who was born the same day with him. She was the daughter of Levi, and she owed her name divine splendor to the celestial light that radiated from her countenance, much like the Rebbetzin. She was worthy of being her husband's helpmeet, for she was one of the midwives that had imperiled their own life to rescue the little Hebrew babes. Indeed, if God had not allowed a miracle to happen, she and her daughter Miriam would have been killed by Pharaoh for having resisted his orders and saved the Hebrew children alive. When the king sent his hangman for the 2 women, God caused them to become invisible, and the bailiffs had to return without accomplishing their errand. Okay? God has a habit of turning us invisible when we need to. It says, the first child of union between Amram and Jochebed, his wife, was 126 years old at the time of her marriage, was a girl. The mother called her Miriam, which means bitterness. For it was at the time of her birth that the Egyptians began to envenom the life of the Hebrews. The second child was a boy named Aaron, which means woe unto his pregnancy, because Pharaoh's instructions to the midwives to kill the male children of the Hebrews was proclaimed during the months that she bore Aaron. Now we come to the birth of Moshe. When Amram separated from his wife on account of the edict published against the male children of the Hebrews, and his example was followed by all the Israelites, his daughter Miriam said to him, "Father, your decree is worse than Pharaoh's decree." Now the Egyptians, she said, aim to destroy only the male children, but you include the little girls as well. Pharaoh deprives his victims of life in this world, but you prevent children from being born and thus deprive them also of the future world. He resolves destruction, but who knows whether the intention of the wicked can persist? You are a righteous man, and the enactments of the righteous are executed by God. Hence, your decree will be upheld. Now, Amram recognized the justice of her plea, and he repaired to the Sanhedrin and put the matter before the body. The members of the court spoke up and said, "It was you that did separate husbands and wives, and from you should go forth the permission for remarriage." So Amram then made a proposition that each of the members of the Sanhedrin should return to his wife and wed her clandestinely. But his colleagues repudiated the plan, saying, "And who will make it known unto the whole of Israel?" Accordingly, Amram stood publicly under the wedding canopy with his divorced wife Jochebed, while Aaron and Miriam danced about it, and the angels proclaimed, "Let the mother of children be joyful." His remarriage was solemnized with great ceremony, to the end that the men that had followed his example in divorcing their wives might imitate him now in taking them again unto themselves. And so it happened. Old as Jochebed was, she regained her youth. Her skin became soft, wrinkles in her face disappeared, and warm tints of the maiden's beauty returned, and in a short time she became pregnant. Now, I want to point out something here, okay? Jochebed, what's important to note about this story is the miracle, okay? Yeshua was born of an obvious miracle. So was Moses. His mother, according to some accounts, was as much as, I believe, 130 years old at the time of his birth. That is a little beyond, just a little, beyond childbearing years. Just a little, okay? As little Abigail of blessed memory used to say, my 3-pound chihuahua, she's always had mini paws. Abigail. She got her humor from me. So it says, Amram was very uneasy about his wife's being with child. He knew not what to do. He turned to God in prayer and entreated him to have compassion upon those who had in no wise transgressed the laws of his worship and afford them deliverance from the misery they endured, while he rendered abortive the hope of their enemies who yearned for the destruction of their nation. Now God had mercy on him, and he stood by him in his sleep and exhorted him not to despair of his future favors. He said further that he did not forget their piety, and he would always reward them for it, as he had granted his favor in other days unto their forefathers. Know therefore, the Lord said, that I shall provide for you altogether what is for your good, and for you in particular that which shall make you celebrated. For the child out of dread, whose nativity the Egyptians have doomed the Israelite children to destruction, shall be this child of yours, and he shall remain concealed from those who watch to destroy him. And when he has been bred up in a miraculous way, he shall deliver the Hebrew nation from the distress that they are under by reason of the Egyptians. His memory shall be celebrated while the world lasts, and not only among the Hebrews, but among the strangers. And all this shall be the effect of my favor towards you and your posterity. Also his brother shall be such that he shall obtain my priesthood for himself and his posterity after him until the end of the world. The Aaronic priesthood, ladies and gentlemen, never ends. God says it is eternal, forever and ever. There's no such thing as an end to the priesthood, God forbid, or, for that matter, an end to the temple. Is everybody aware, by the way, that the temple on earth was merely a type and shadow of the temple that exists in heaven? The temple on earth has been destroyed, but not the one in heaven. Okay? And the order of Melchizedek does not replace the Aaronic priesthood. So it goes on to say, after he had been informed of these things by the vision, Amram awoke and told all to his wife Jacob. Now let's pause here and say something. It just said that he had a vision in a dream. He was sleeping and had the vision. In other words, he was concerned about his wife being with child. He was concerned about all the nuances about it. And God sent him a vision in a dream, a vision while he was yet sleeping, to tell him it's going to be okay. You know, this child you're going to have is going to be really blessed, and his brother is going to be blessed, etc. Does this sound remotely like maybe Yeshua's father having a similar situation? Yes, it does. Why? Because like the first Redeemer, the final Redeemer, okay? So it says, his daughter Miriam likewise had a prophetic dream, and she related it unto her parents, saying, in this night I saw a man clothed in fine linen. Tell your father and your mother, he said, that he who shall be born unto them shall be cast into the waters, and through him the waters shall become dry, and wonders and miracles shall be performed through him, and he shall save my people Israel, and be their leader forever. During her pregnancy, notice that, by the way, I like that, be their leader forever. Moses is still our leader, okay? So it says, during her pregnancy, Jochebed observed that the child in her womb was destined for great things. All the time she suffered no pain, and also she suffered none in giving birth to her son, for pious women are not included in the curse pronounced upon Eve, decreeing sorrow in conception and in childbearing. And all the women said, Amen. At the moment of the child's appearance, the whole house was filled with radiance equal to the splendor of the sun and the moon. A still greater miracle followed. The infant was not yet a day old when he began to walk and speak with his parents as though he were an adult. He refused to drink milk from his mother's breast. Jochebed gave birth to the child 6 months after conception. So there he was. It was only 6 months after conception. The Egyptian bailiffs who kept strict watch over all the pregnant women in order to be on the spot in time of to carry off their newborn boys had not expected her delivery for 3 months more. These 3 months, the parents succeeded in keeping the babe concealed, though every Israelite house was guarded by 2 Egyptian women, one stationed within and one without. At the end of this time, they determined to expose the child, for Amram was afraid that both he and his son would be devoted to death if the secret leaked out, and he thought it better to entrust the child's fate to divine providence. He was convinced that God would protect the boy and fulfill his word in truth. Baruch HaShem. Now, before I continue on to the next part, I wanted to read this from Rabbi Monk's commentary. Because remember what I was saying about, you hear from anti-missionaries and there's talk about, well, the lineage of Yeshua's parents, and they want to get real specific about it. One thing you should recognize is that, and this is an absolute fact I'm about to tell you, okay? This is 100% truth, as is everything I say. But in this particular case, I want to emphasize this point. When we write Western history in modern times, we are very specific. Very specific. I have read a lot of military history, and they'll tell you what regiment moved out at what time on what road and where they attacked specifically, what part of the battlefield they walked through. I mean, it gets real specific. That's not how ancient Eastern histories were written. Ancient Eastern histories were written very vague. They would just say there was a battle between the Romans and the Greeks, and the Romans won. That's all, and that was it. That's all you learn. You know, you're not going to learn which regiment of Romans marched out ahead of the others and so forth, right? So when it comes down to these fine details that everybody wants to harp on, that's just not the point. The point is the event that happened, right? Now, to prove this, let me go to Rabbi Monk's commentary, and he says, the Torah here omits naming the father and mother of Moses. It is as if Moses' birth is shrouded in mystery. Now, this is probably the Torah's way of describing the oppressive atmosphere which prevailed at the time of Moses' birth, which necessitated underground resistance. That comes from Rabbi Hirsch. Now, the Maharal provides another explanation. Moses' birth was a historical event foreseen by providence from the beginning of time. This event is not at all tied to a particular family name. There was a man and there was a woman of noble family who got married and gave birth to Moses. Nothing else need be said. Okay? So the point of the history was Moses was born, and Moses is the Redeemer. All the specifics of his family are not all that important, right? My point being is when we come to the Messiah and we have what about this? What about these little, that doesn't seem to match. You're missing the point. The point is a Savior is born, and he's going to be the Redeemer of his people, just like Moses. When you go back to Moses' birth in the Torah, there's not a lot of details about it. We find details in ancient sources, right, but not necessarily in the Torah itself. Like Yeshua's father's Yosef. So I wanted to point that out. It's very important for us to understand that. Don't let people trip you up with the details, because that's just not the way history was written 2,000, 3,000 years ago, okay? Not like it's written today by any stretch. And anybody tells you different, ignore them. They obviously don't study history, okay? So I'm on page 13. I'm just kidding. I'm on page 476, 477. I'm Rabbi Monk's commentary. I'm on page 13 in Rabbi Monk's commentary. So I keep changing sources on you, Sarah. So I wanted to read a couple more insights from Rabbi Monk really quickly. Rabbi Monk brings down Vetera oto ki tov hu. She saw that he was good. Now, Rabbi Monk says, everyone knows that all women love their children, okay? So goodly or not, and that they do, whether they're good or not, they do their utmost to keep them safe, all right? So, in other words, he says, it was hardly necessary to justify Jochebed's actions by mentioning that her son was good. Like every mom would say that, right, about the kids, what he's trying to say. Accordingly, it must be concluded that she noticed something out of the ordinary. When she said the child is good, there must be something, right? Now, this something had to indicate that this newborn would live. Consequently, she did everything in her power to ensure that he would, in fact, survive. This tends to confirm the teaching of our sages, that when Moses was born, the whole house was flooded with light, and that he was of exceptional physical perfection, even being born circumcised, Sota 12a. But Totafot explains that Jochebed first thought her son would die. For as Rashi points out, he was born premature in the 6 months of pregnancy. But having observed that his nails were fully formed, a proof of viability, she immediately took every precaution to safeguard his future. Now, I want to read this next part, which gets a little bit ahead of our story in the Legend of the Jews, but I want to read it for a particular purpose. It says, she took him and put him in a wicker basket. So the Torah here says, Vaitikach lo teva gomeh. The reason I wanted to read that in Hebrew is because the word I'm sorry, I said teva, it's tevat gomeh. Tevat is the same word as the ark that Noah got into. had the pitch on it. So just like the ark of Noah had pitch on the outside, the baby's ark had pitch. In other words, it's not really a basket. The word is tevat, from the Hebrew teva. It's an ark. And the word teva literally means word. So in order for Noah and his family to be saved, they had to get into the word. And by the way, the word pitch comes from the word kippur, atonement. So in order to be saved, you had to get into the word that was covered in atonement. In order for Moshe to be the one to save Israel, he had to be put into the word covered with atonement. You see? So I wanted to point that out on the reading here of Rabbi Monk. We're going to come back to Rabbi Monk in just a moment as we get into the teaching of Pharaoh's daughter. I also wanted to mention, I want to mention an insight from the Midrash Rabbah Shemot, chapter 1, Siman 32. This is just a aside here. It says, this is Jethro. So it says they came to their father Reuel. We haven't got here yet in the story, but Jethro is Reuel. Remember we said Reuel, that's Jethro. Why is he called Reuel? Because he became a friend of God, because the word friend is re'ah, of God. How did he become a friend of God? By abandoning idolatry and embracing the service of God. So, I am a friend of God. He calls me friend. Not if you don't embrace the covenant. So if you don't embrace the Torah, he calls you enemy. I never knew you. I'm not a friend of God. Why am I cast out in the place of wailing and gnashing of teeth? Those lyrics got deleted from that song. All right, so let's go on to the next reading. All right, it says, Jacob accordingly took an ark, or Jochebed, excuse me, I said Jacob, pardon me, Jochebed, slicha. Jochebed accordingly took an ark fashioned of bulrushes, daubed it with pitch on the outside, and lined it with clay within. The reason to use bulrushes was because they float on the surface of the water, and she put pitch only on the outside to protect the child as much as possible against any of the annoyances of disagreeable odor. Over the child as it lay in the ark, she spread a teeny canopy to shade the babe with the words, perhaps I shall not live to see him under the marriage canopy. And then she abandoned the ark on the shores of the Red Sea. Yet it was not left unguarded. Her daughter Miriam stayed nearby to discover whether a prophecy she had uttered would be fulfilled. Before the child's birth, her sister had foretold that her mother would bring forth a son who would be the Redeemer of Israel. When he was born and the house was filled with brilliant light, Amram kissed her on the head, but when she was forced into the expediency of exposing the child, he beat her on the head, saying, my daughter, what has become of your prophecy? Yikes. Therefore Miriam stayed and strolled along the shore to observe what would become of the fate of the babe and what would come of her prophecy concerning him. Now the day the child was exposed was the 21st of the month of Nisan, the same day upon which the Israelites later, under the leadership of Moses, sang the song of praise and gratitude to God for the redemption of the waters of the sea. So he was put into the water on the very same day that later the waters would part and swallow up the Egyptians. The 21st of Nisan, which is the 7th day of Passover, which is a Yom Tov. Yes, ma'am. Yes, that's true. When Noah was born, light shined from his face as well. So we have light shining from Abraham, Noah, and Moses. And then, of course, Yeshua as well. All of those things are connected, right? It's not just one thing. A lot of people don't know that. They think that it's isolated to Yeshua, right? It's not. It's in the sources. So it says, the angels appeared before God and spoke up and said, O Lord of the world, shall he that is appointed to sing a song of praise unto thee on this day of Nisan, which, by the way, is one of the primordial songs of creation. That's not written here, but that's just the fact. It says, to thank thee for rescuing him and his people from the sea, shall he find his death in the sea today? The Lord replied, you know well that I see all things. The contriving of man can do naught to change what hath been resolved in my counsel. Those do not attain their end who use cunning and malice to secure their own safety and endeavor to bring ruin upon their fellow men. But he who trusts in me in his peril will be conveyed from profoundest distress to unlooked for happiness. Thus my omnipotence will reveal itself in the fortunes of this babe. At that time of the child's abandonment, God sent scorching heat to plague the Egyptians, and they all suffered with leprosy and smarting boils. Thermutis, the daughter of Pharaoh, sought relief from the burning pain and a bath in the waters of the Nile. But physical discomfort was not her only reason for leaving her father's palace. She determined to cleanse herself as well from the impurity of the idol worship that prevailed there. Now, I'm going to read something about this woman who here is named Thermutis, but later she's going to become known as Bithiah. Okay? What I want to read to you is really, really important here, because what we're going to see is that Bithiah, who becomes a convert, is going to become the mother of the Redeemer, who is going to raise him in Egypt, who is going to save his people from their slavery. Meaning that it is the Messiah is going to be reared by the one who converts to Judaism. Okay? And the Messiah is going to be revealed from the proverbial bosom of the convert. Not from the Gentile. Not from the Egyptian. Bithiah was not an Egyptian anymore. But she was still living in the Egyptian household. She wasn't joined with the people of Israel. Okay? But she endeavored to leave idolatry. Something in her said, this is idolatry, and I want to go be cleansed of it. And God evidently, sovereignly, spoke to her and said, you need to be immersed in a mikveh, go to the Nile. And so she went to the Nile to be immersed in water. This is what I've just read to you in the Legend of the Jews is brought down in the Talmud. Okay? It's brought down in the Midrash Rabbah, which I'm going to read in just a moment. It's also talked about in Rabbi Munt's commentary. Everybody knows that the daughter of Pharaoh who raised Moses was, in fact, a convert to Judaism. It's a fact, okay? So, it goes on to say here, she was determined to cleanse herself as well of the impurity of idol worship that prevailed there, okay? When she saw the little ark floating among the flags of the surface of the water, she supposed it to contain one of the little children exposed at her father's order, and she commanded her handmaids to fetch it. Now understand, think about this. Zakin Yigal has said this. If you don't have a Jewish mind, you're not going to be able to embrace the Torah. And it's kind of a catch-22. Because there's many people who aren't yet Jews who are trying to really embrace the Torah, and they're going to get to a certain level, but you can only go so far until you really become Jewish, and then it's going to blow up. And I want you to think about Bithiah. She went to the Nile, she immersed in the water, came up out of the water, no longer Theramutis, but now Bithiah, daughter of God, which means daughter of God, and immediately God revealed the Torah to her. She embraced the Torah of HaShem immediately when she came up out of the water. She came up out of the water. Think about that. Let's just ponder that for a moment. This woman said, all this idolatry is garbage. I'm going to leave my father's house, not literally, but spiritually, and I'm going to go into the water. She didn't know that a little baby boy was going to float by, and she didn't know that that baby boy was going to become the Redeemer of Israel. She didn't know that she would become the mother of Israel, of the Redeemer. But she went into the water, came up, and took hold of a baby boy. And if I may be privileged to throw out just an esoteric concept, it was like a virgin birth, because suddenly she became the mother of a child, and the Shekinah is directly involved. And I'll come to that in just a moment as we get to Rabbi Monk's commentary. So let me read this a little bit further, and then I'll read Rabbi Monk's commentary. All right, so let me read this. I'll go back to Rabbi Monk. It says, when she saw the little ark flowing among the flags of the surface of the water, she suspected it might be one of the children. She sent her handmaids to fetch it. But they protested and said, our mistress, it happens sometimes that a decree issued by a king is unheeded, yet it is observed at least by his children and the members of his household, and do you desire to transgress your father's edict? Forthwith, the angel Gabriel appeared, seized all the maids except one, whom he permitted the princess to retain for her service, and buried them in the bowels of the earth. Pharaoh's daughter now proceeded to do all her own will. She stretched forth her arm, and although the ark was swimming at a distance of 60 eels, she succeeded in grasping it because her arm was lengthened miraculously. Let me just pause right here. Many of the superheroes that were created in comic books are created by Jews. Does anyone remember Mr. Fantastic from the Fantastic Four? He could stretch, right? Now, I don't know. I do not know if Mr. Fantastic, if the idea of Mr. Fantastic came from this Midrash. But what I just read to you is a very well-known Midrash that God supernaturally caused Bithiah's limbs to expand. I'm just saying, okay? So it says, no sooner had she touched it than the leprosy afflicting her departed from her. So now, when she takes hold of the Redeemer, leprosy leaves her body. There was something about leprosy in the Gospels. I can't remember. There's a couple of mentions of it. You see how important, but can I just pause here and have a commercial for the importance of Jewish literature? You see how important Jewish literature is? If you don't know the sources, then the Gospel is going to be like, oh yeah, there's leprosy, and he touched people and it left. But now it takes us all the way back to Moses. Isn't it amazing? So it says, her sudden restoration led her to examine the contents of the ark, and when she opened it, her amazement was great. She beheld an exquisitely beautiful boy, for God had fashioned the Hebrew babe's body with particular care, and beside it she perceived the Shekinah. So this is what I wanted to bring down, because Rabbi Monk says this exact same thing. Rabbi Monk's commentary? Oh, page 116. Rabbi Monk brings down the exact same commentary where he says she opened and saw the child. It says the literal interpretation is that she saw the child. However, because of the unusual repetition of the construction, the Midrash interprets that she saw the Shekinah, that is the divine presence, hovering over him. This is also hinted at in the next by the silent preposition aleph tav, which may be translated with, indicating that she saw something else with the child, the aleph tav, which is the Shekinah. Okay? So what I'm trying to say here is that I'm not saying it's a direct connection, but what I'm trying to say is you have a single woman who finds the child who happens to be involved with the Shekinah. So you have Shekinah, woman, child. There's a Shekinah, woman, child connection to the first Redeemer is what I'm trying to say. Okay? Incidentally, by the way, there's an interesting insight when you go to the Keo Tumash when it talks about the birth of Isaac. and it talks about, it doesn't actually use the word Shekinah, but it talks about an upper lofty divine energy that comes upon Sarah that enables her to give birth to Isaac. So what would be the upper lofty divine energy, I wonder? Could it be that the Shekinah came upon Sarah and empowered her to give birth? Shane is rebuking that. Shane is, I take authority over that. I bind that. I bind those words. Shane suddenly got super spiritual. Oh, man. Stan Lee was, Couture was saying that Stan Lee, who and created a lot of these comic book characters, was in fact Jewish. Yes. Yeah. Yes, because she, what Shoshana was saying is that because she took hold of the ark, because she took hold of the Torah, she was allowed to take hold of the redemption. You can't have the Redeemer without taking hold of the ark. And you can't have any of that if you're not willing to go into the water and go through to be born again and go through the conversion. So remember, it was Bithiah who got the Redeemer, not the daughter of Pharaoh, Thermerteris or whatever her name was. So, change your name, change your destiny. So she saw the Shekinah, okay. Rabbi Monk does bring down, I won't belabor this point for the sake of time, but Rabbi Monk brings down, in fact, that she was indeed a convert. It's stated in the Talmud. It's not up for debate, in case anybody's wondering. So it goes on to say here, noticing that the boy bore the signs of the Abrahamic covenant, meaning circumcision, she knew that he was one of the Hebrew children, and mindful of her father's decree concerning the male children of Israel, she was about to abandon the babe to his fate. At that moment, the angel Gabriel came and gave the child a vigorous blow, and he began to cry aloud with a voice like a young man's. His vehement weeping and the weeping of Aaron, who was lying beside him, touched the princess, and in her pity she resolved to save him. She ordered an Egyptian woman to be brought to nurse the child, but the little one refused to take milk from her breast, and he refused to take it from anyone who was, from any other Egyptian woman fetched to him. Thus it had to be ordained by God. Now, so Moses would not take any unkosher breast milk. Okay, it had to be OU certified. No hechsher? No. So thus it had been ordained by God that none of them might boast later on and say, I suckled him, that holds conversation now with the Shekinah. Interesting here it says he held conversation with the Shekinah. But the scripture says he held conversation with God. So was it the God or the Shekinah? Yes. So now was the mouth destined to speak with God, to be drawn nourishment from the unclean body of an Egyptian woman? No. Now Miriam stepped into the presence of Thermetus, and thus she had been standing there by chance to look at the child. And she spoke to the princess and said, It is in vain for you, O queen, to call for nurses that are in no wise of kin to the child. But if you will order a woman of the Hebrews to be brought, he may accept her breast, seeing that she is of his own nation. So it says here Thermutus, but I'm going to say Bithiah. Bithiah therefore bade Miriam fetch a Hebrew woman. And with winged steps, speedy like a vigorous youth, she hastened and brought back her own mother, the child's mother, for she knew that none present was acquainted with her. The babe, unresisting, took his mother's breast and clutched it tightly. The princess committed to the child to Jochebed's care, saying these words, which contained an unconscious divination. Here is what is yours. Nurse the boy henceforth, and I will give you 2 silver pieces as your wages. The return of her son safe and sound after she had exposed him was Jacob's reward from God for her service as one of the midwives that had bidden defiance to Pharaoh's command and saved the Hebrew children alive. By exposing their son to danger, Amram and Jochebed had effected the withdrawal of Pharaoh's command and joining the extermination of the Hebrew men children. That's an interesting point. By exposing the child to danger, it canceled the evil decree. Interesting. It says, the day Moses was set adrift in the little ark, the astrologers had come to Pharaoh and told him the glad tidings that the danger threatening the Egyptians on account of the boy whose doom lay in the water had now been averted. Thereupon Pharaoh cried a halt to the drowning of the boys of his empire. The astrologers had seen something, but they knew not what they had seen, and they announced a message, the import of which they did not comprehend. Water was indeed the doom of Moses, but that did not mean that he would perish in the waters of the Nile. It had referenced to the waters of Meribah, the waters of strife, and how they would cause his death in the desert before he had completed his task of leading the people into the promised land. Now Pharaoh, misled by the obscure vision of his astrologers, thought that the fortune redeemer of Israel was to lose his life by drowning and make sure that the boy who appeared was foretold by the astrologers might not escape his fate. He had ordered all the boys, even the children of the Egyptians, born during the period of 9 months, to be cast in the waters. On account of the merits of Moses, the 600,000 men, children of the Hebrews, begotten in the same night with him, and thrown into the waters on the same day, were rescued miraculously together with him. And it was therefore not an idle boast, if he said later, the people that went forth out of the water on account of my merits are 600,000 men. Amen, amen. We're going to take another 15-minute break. We'll come back for a third segment. Thank you so much for being here. We'll come back and continue our study of the Torah. We're still in the first parashah.